Hi, I'm Lynn Cornell, and welcome to Journey Through the Bible Verse by Verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study through each book of the Bible, verse by verse and chapter by chapter. Now, I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're reading from a different Bible translation, the read is different, the message the same. We're going to continue now studying the Gospel of Mark, and we're in chapter 8. Now, just again from a time perspective, and we'll see how this is, the importance of this is going to play out as we move forward. We're in the last 6 months of Jesus' earthly ministry. So everything is kind of moving towards Jerusalem, the Passover, his betrayal, arrest, trial, death, and resurrection. And so a lot of these events, you see that some of Jesus' most powerful miracles are happening or being displayed during this time as well. All right, verse 1. In those days, there was a large, verse 1 again. In those days, there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. And he summoned his disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry, they will collapse on the way. And some of them have come from long distance. And again, today we would have called this like a camp meeting. And people were so enamored, so caught up in Jesus was extremely busy with this crowd, teaching, ministering to them through healings and miracles, okay, that 3 days had went by. And what's more amazing that many of them have ate nothing. And so Jesus is saying, I'm not going to send them away hungry. Verse 4, his disciples answered, where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to fill these people? How many loaves do you have? He asked them. 7, they said. Then he commanded the crowds to sit down on the ground. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke the loaves and kept on giving them to his disciples to set before the people. So they served the loaves to the crowd. They also had a few small fish, and when he had blessed them, he said these were to be served as well. And they ate and were filled, and they collected 7 large baskets leftover pieces. About 4,000 men were there. He dismissed them, and immediately got into a boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmatia. Now, again, 4,000 men were the men counting. I mean, the number was counting of men itself, not the women and children. So this conservatively could have been anywhere from 15 to 20,000 easily. Okay, and notice they were fed fish and bread as much as they wanted. So all right, verse 11. Then the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, demanding of him a sign from heaven to test him. But sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation demand a sign? And I assure you, no sign will be given to this generation. Then he left them and got aboard a boat again and went to the other side. Now, again, in Matthew's gospel, he kind of covers this incident more in depth. But Jesus is irritated by them because basically, remember, the sign that they're asking for wasn't that they were looking for the truth. That's why he sort of ignored them. He didn't really care. They wasn't looking for the truth. And so he kind of dismissed them. However, it bothers them. It bothered Jesus. Well, he's thinking about their hardness of their heart. So, verse 14, now they had forgotten to take bread and had only 1 loaf with him in the boat. And he commanded them, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Okay. Now again, in Matthew, they began to argue among themselves because they hadn't taken any bread. Now, verse 16, they were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. Aware of this, he said to them, "Why are you discussing that you do not have any bread? Don't you understand and comprehend? Is your heart hardened?" Now, this is the second time we kind of see this phrase used in Mark's gospel, that their lack of perception is because of a hardened heart. Verse 18, do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves and the 5,000, how many baskets full of pieces of bread you collected? 12, they told him. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces of bread did you collect? 7, they said. And he said to them, don't you understand yet? Now remember, this lack of understanding that he's chiding them is because of their hardness of heart. And that's interesting. Okay? And remember, Jesus had even said that take care how you hear. See, how you hear. If you take it and then do something with it, act upon it, it's going to grow. But if you don't, what you have is going to be taken away from you. Verse 22, then they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him, and he begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village. Spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, did you see anything? Now, it's kind of interesting. We see Jesus, the different ways in which Jesus would heal. Sometimes he would spit on the ground and he made a mud puddle and put it on the person's eyes. Here he's actually spitting on the guy's eyes, you know. If you notice, that's why he did it away from the crowd. You know, he took the guy aside and he spit in his eyes, you know, because that would be quite dramatic. But now watch what happens. And Jesus asked him, do you see anything? He looked up and he said, I see people. They look to me like trees walking. And again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes and he saw distinctively. And he was cured and could see everything clearly. Now, interesting that the first attempt, I'm not saying his attempt, I don't know why, but the first, when he did that, it wasn't sort of a complete healing. It certainly would justify Jesus spitting on the man's eyes. So let me just say this. Don't emulate what you see in the scriptures unless you know God is telling you. Jesus had the power, and he did that. And the reason why I say that is because there are people sometimes that try to emulate things they see in the Bible. And they would try to do these kinds of stunts. This would be sort of a very nasty stunt. Okay, especially if the man if you don't produce the healing. Now this man, on this first round, he was blurred. He said, I see him like trees. It was the blur. And then the second time, Jesus, when he laid his hands on him, he saw clearly. We're not giving a reason why. It just happened that way. Verse 27, Jesus went out with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they answered him, John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. And again, this is unfortunate. Remember, he's asking this question after all of the miracles. And what is interesting about this, by the way, is that all of these people would say, and to the crowds, and point to Jesus, that this is who Jesus is pointing to. Or I should put it like this. John said this about Jesus, right? That Jesus is the Lamb of God. He is the coming one. Elijah is a type of John the Baptist who was saying, and also Elijah in many respects to be a type of Christ in terms of the miracles and the power that points to the coming one. So he says, but you, he asked them again, who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. And he strictly warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and rise after 3 days. Now, what's amazing with this kind of transition here is that on the one hand, Peter makes this great confession. You are the Son of God. Then in verse 32, he was openly talking about this. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and looking on his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get thee behind me, Satan, because you are not thinking about God's concerns, but about man's." Now, what is interesting about this rebuke, notice Jesus looks at his disciples. Now, in using the term Satan, a couple of questions we can ask. Was Jesus speaking to Satan, who might have been behind the scenes, urging Peter on, putting the thoughts in Peter's mind? Possible. We could also say this: thank God that Jesus didn't listen to Peter. But the word Satan himself means adversary. And so Jesus could have been, and I believe this is the case, speaking directly to Peter, basically saying, yes, you're acting in the role of Satan, but you're being an adversary against me because you are coming directly against the will of God. As I said, what if Jesus had to listen to Peter? See, what if Jesus had listened to Peter? See, where would we be in the world today? So verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and rise after 3 days. Oh, I'm sorry. I already read that. Verse 34. Summoning the crowd, along with his disciples, he said to them. Now, what we find here is Jesus had the 12 that he had called, and they were his apostles. There was an extended crowd of people that sort of followed Jesus around all the time as well. They're going to be mentioned later that they're going to choose from this extended crowd Judas' replacement. So he says, he said to them, if anyone wants to be my follower, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses life because of me and the gospel will save it. For what does it benefit a man if he gain the whole world yet loses his life? And what can a man give in exchange for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be also ashamed of him when he comes into his glory of his Father with his holy angels. Now, this is in response to Peter's attempted pity on Jesus to get him not to, fulfill the will of God. So, and of course, in Peter's defense, he wasn't looking at it that way. He was looking at it from a human perspective, that he didn't want Jesus to suffer. He didn't want Jesus to be taken away from them. Remember, they had grown attached to Jesus, dependent on Jesus. He was their everything. And even though Jesus is just the man Jesus, that's not what the will of God was. And so Peter, in a sense, was just responding in a human way, but it was a wrong human way. So now he's telling the disciples, if you want to be a disciple of mine, here's my criteria. You have to be willing to deny yourself. And that goes a long way, by the way, because a lot of people do not understand this level of commitment. And it is basic. It is unabashed. Jesus doesn't make any apology for it. This is it. You have to surrender your entire being if you want to be his disciples. And so he said, if you are ashamed of me. And the word shame here doesn't mean in the sense of embarrassment only, but it means to shrink away from. That you want to shrink away from certain things of life. He said, you can't be that and be my disciple.